So, I don't know if you guys are too young to remember Game Sharks. I'm not even sure if they make them anymore. They were this cool little thing that you could plug into a game console and use to hack the game and discover cheats. My buddy still has one for his old Nintendo 64, and we still like to mess around with it sometimes. I found a used copy of Majora's Mask the other day, and I realized we'd never tried to hack it, so I dropped $5 on the cartridge. Last night I called up my friend, grabbed a case of beer, and went over to his house for some sweet drunken retro gaming. We were having a great time, making Link fall through floors and walk through walls and all that good stuff. We even found a code that caused a huge number of those annoying little dogs to spawn, swamping the map and generally causing chaos. After the standard cheats got boring, we decided to run the code search on the Game Shark again. Oddly enough, the Game Shark came up with a brand new code sequence, one we'd never seen before. Being slightly buzzed from the beer and bored with throwing infinite bombs at unsuspecting enemies, we punched the code in and fired up the game. Game Sharks have a tendency to cause minor glitches, so neither of us was very surprised when the game completely skipped over the menu screens and jumped directly into the action. We were outside of the snow temple, and the clock was stuck at a couple minutes to midnight on the third day. The moon was leering at us from the sky, nearly ready to crash into the ground. Other than the frozen time, the game seemed to be functional, so I pushed forward on the control stick and sent Link off in exploration of the world as it teetered directly on the brink of the apocalypse. There was a distinct lack of enemies, and strange patterns of pixels would randomly appear and disappear. Naturally, we were starting to get pretty bored since we had nothing to kill. I decided to shut the console down and try another code, but I figured I'd look up at the moon one more time. To my surprise, it was much larger than it had been before, and we realized that it was still approaching the Earth despite the fact that time was stopped. It was nearly ready to crash down, so we decided to see if anything cool would happen in the endgame cutscene. Oddly enough, the cutscene never triggered. Instead, the moon just kept getting closer and closer. I could barely make out movement on it, and I realized that the spinning Majora's Mask from the menu screen was appearing on the surface in a flurry of oddly shaped pixels. The spinning mask continued to get clearer and clearer until it completely hid the moon's evil grin. Something seemed very wrong with the mask though, it seemed too well animated for an image on a Nintendo 64. The lines and details were very clear, and the colors were far too vivid. As the mask spun around, the eyes seemed to follow me, staring directly at me. I was hypnotized by it, and I sat there, beer in one hand, controller in the other, unable to look away from the screen. Extremely disturbing images began to flash across the TV screen as the moon continued to approach. Everything appeared to be on fire, and quick glimpses of the poor, innocent animated characters of the town showed them dying extremely gruesome deaths. Majora's Mask completed one final rotation and stopped, staring directly at us. A gnarled hand came up, slowly pulling the mask away, and underneath was the Skull Kid, a horrible expression of agony and pain burned on his face. He opened his mouth, and with a sickening groan of cartridge-era video game sounds, uttered the words that have been haunting me at night. "You lost the game." The screen went pitch black, and the Nintendo 64 shut off. Me and my friend looked at each other, unsure of what we'd just seen. He claims it was just an alternate ending the producers didn't use in the actual game, but the whole thing seemed way too paranormal to be that easily explained. On March 12, 2007, on the /e/award4chan, an anonymous user posted a GIF image. At first glance, strangely, the GIF image wasn't animated. It was titled "I'm Happy GIF" and showed what appeared to be a drawing of a smiley face, only with realistic-looking eyes and mouth. People who clicked on it saw the smiley face's smile slowly turn into a frown, and the eyes taking on an angrier appearance. The smiley face would then scream loudly loud enough to burst eardrums and gruesome images of rapes, bomb test victims, aborted fetuses, mutilated bodies, and animals being tortured would flash by quickly. After about 5 minutes, it would show the text, "Have a nice day," and the user's computer would automatically close out of the browser and would stop working, as if a virus had corrupted the hard drive. People whose computers were infected would shortly be found in their homes, skinned and mutilated, with a smiley face painted in blood on the floor next to their corpses. The founder of 4chan, Moot, would always claim that the picture never existed and that the murders were unrelated. However, somewhere in the archives, the picture still exists. Most people who attempt to post it are usually swiftly banned by Moot. There is a video on YouTube named Mereana mordegard glesgorv. If you search this, you will find nothing. The few times you find something, all you will see is a 20-second video of a man staring intently at you, expressionless, then grinning, for the last 2 seconds. The background is undefined. This is only part of the actual video. The full video lasts 2 minutes, and was removed by YouTube after 153 people who viewed the video gouged out their eyes and mailed them to YouTube's main office in San Bruno. Said people had also committed suicide in various ways. It is not yet known how they managed to mail their eyes after gouging them out. The cryptic inscription they carved on their forearms has not yet been deciphered. YouTube will periodically put up the first 20 seconds of the video to quell suspicions, so that people will not go look for the real thing and upload it. The video itself was only viewed by one YouTube staff member, who started screaming after 45 seconds. This man is now under constant sedation and is apparently unable to recall what he saw. The other people who were in the same room as him while he viewed it and turned off the video for him say that all they heard at the time was a high-pitched drilling sound. None of them dared look at the screen. The person who uploaded the video was never found, the IP address being non-existent. And the man in the video has never been identified. When I was a child, one of my favorite games was The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Anyone who's played it can probably figure out why, even if they don't particularly find it their favorite. Naturally, as a very popular game, it spawned a lot of rumors and legends, especially back in the day when communication through the internet wasn't as common. Most of these legends are false, but sometimes a surprising amount of truth can be found in them. A while ago, I had read an article about early versions of Zelda 3D, as it was called in development, and apparently these early versions were incredibly different from the released version. It was modeled after the original Legend of Zelda rather than A Link to the Past, and as such was a lot more free-roaming and adventurous than the one we got. At the time, it sounded awesome, and I even found myself wondering why they had abandoned the project. I concluded that it was probably due to the technical requirements of such a feat. Still, one thing that especially stuck with me were the pictures. Some were nondescript, nothing special, but one showed a large expansive desert environment. There was a palm tree and a small oasis, near a much more primitive-looking Link, as well as some enemies. Past that, however, was just sand, stretching to the horizon. The thoughts of what might lay beyond that desert seemed to stick the image to my mind. After that we skipped several years. The article was only a vague recollection, nothing important. I was hanging out at the local game shop with one of my friends. He's telling me about his day, and tells me how some guy came to sell his missing son's old video games. He showed me them and they were all normal games. A few Wii games, a few GameCube games, and a lot of Nintendo 64 games. Still, the only one that really caught my eye was a red cartridge with no label except a piece of tape with the word ZELDA written over it in marker. Naturally, this got me curious. My friend didn't share my curiosity, but he didn't think he could sell the game and just let me take it home for free and indulge myself. Naturally, I did. The moment the game started, I realized it wasn't the Zelda I was used to. The title screen was nothing but a nondescript The Legend of Zelda. No subtitles, no fancy font, no music, just those words in black bordered lettering. The background wasn't from Moon or MM either. It was an overhead view of what could only be called ancient ruins. They looked very sinister and grotesque, similar to something from Majora's Mask, only without any hint of the mystical atmosphere that accompanied any Zelda game. They were simply unnerving. Still, this didn't stop my curiosity, it only kept me going. As soon as I press start, the game begins. It skips over any file screens and dumps a blocky-looking Link into an empty black environment. And when I say black, I mean black. There was nothing separating ground and sky. Just blackness. The only thing that let me notice that the game even worked was a temple in the distance, similar to the one in the opening. Moving still seemed to work fine, suggesting that something probably glitched with the textures of the ground and sky. Still, it seemed strange that nothing happened to any other textures. Entering the temple was my only choice, so I took it. One thing that is worth mentioning is that the game started with no music, just deathly silence. However, the closer you came to the temple, the more music was available to hear. Well, it wasn't really music. It sounded like moaning, similar to the Rededzinut, but more tinny and badly recorded. Every once in a while some sobs could be heard, but they were quickly stifled. Entering the temple made everything seem more like a Zelda game, but something caught my eye. Rather than the textures being worse than those in Ut, they were better. There was more detail in everything, but it was all dingy and rotten looking. Extra polygons only served to make things look more grotesque. The random blood splatters didn't help anything, either. It didn't take long for me to realize that the entire dungeon could hardly be called Zelda-like. Puzzles usually only consisted of pulling a lever or pressing a switch. In fact, there weren't even any sliding blocks. There were no enemies, either, but the blood splatters on the wall soon served to be warnings of booby traps. Some become inescapable and simply send you back into the darkness again. Others are escapable, but still extremely creepy and depressing. The dungeon was riddled with low-poly remains of dead adventurers, and sometimes they even had items on them. The items could be picked up, but the inventory screen seemed unfinished, and the game only auto-equipped the first 3 items picked up since there was no accessible inventory screen. After several gruesome deaths and retries, I find my way to a door marked with a scratched-on eye, similar to the ones on the lens of truth and various other objects. Entering this door revealed a boss battle. The music, by this point, had changed, and I only realized it by the last room. The moaning had never looped once, but still seemed to change according to the mood. A discordant violin melody started playing, but the rest of the sound remained nothing but moans, sobs, yells, and weird scratching. It was never enough to rise past the level of background noise, but it still remained unnerving, almost as if it wasn't music at all, but monsters that were wandering somewhere in the temple. When I said entering the room revealed a boss battle, I was not entirely honest. It could only be called a boss battle by the most generous standards. It featured an empty room with the same textures on the walls as the rest of the temple. The only out-of-place aspect was a giant face on the other side of the room, colored as gray as the walls surrounding it. Its skin seemed stretched over its head and lined with the wall, so it looked as if the wall was growing a face. Moss seemed to be growing over its closed eyes, and cracks were apparent everywhere on it. Still, the door I came in was locked, and the only thing to do was approach. I did so, carefully, making sure nothing was waiting for a surprise attack. I went up to the point where I was nearly in contact with a face. Nothing. It was still there, with its sunken eyes and cracked lips. I attacked it with my sword. The sword went through and made an incredibly vulgar flesh-ripping sound, but nothing happened. It remained there. I attacked some more, and still more, until eventually the music stopped. Soon the cacophony of violin music became even louder and the moans started up even stronger, and then something happened. In one movement, its eyes opened, staring at me with dry, soulless eyeballs. And then nothing. The music was still louder, but I continued to attack the face, with no reaction, until it simply had enough, ripped to shreds, and fell away in a fire, in typical Zelda fashion, revealing a door. The music had stopped. There were no more moans, screams, anything. I went through the door. What a fool I was. That was only the tutorial. The screen was replaced by a white screen, followed by a moment of extremely loud Brownian noise. I jumped, but it was over almost instantly. The white screen was replaced by endless desert. The one from the image. I was in shock. By that point, I was creeped out enough to turn the game off. Still, that respite didn't last long. I had nightmares of the game. Normal nightmares, nothing weird about them. It was, after all, a pretty creepy game. However, what frightened me the most was something I skimmed over while I played and realized afterwards. The game changed each time I started over. When I tried to take the same path through the labyrinth, I always ended up lost and confused. By the time I finished, I was relying on instinct. I kept going the next day, stopping only to eat and go to the bathroom. When I turned it on, I was still at the desert, even though there was no file screen. This time it was night. I walked. Sometimes I would walk for 20 minutes only to find a half-sunken obelisk or the ruins of what looked like some village hut. Other times there would be a skull or a few bones, but nothing more noticeable than that. Other times I would see great expanses of oasis and tropical forests. I found my first enemies here. They were similar to tektites, only with larger bodies, mostly containing their large eye. They had thin, long legs and would still attack by leaping. Only when they hit you, they would pin you to the ground and attack. Soon the sun rose, and I continued walking. Sometimes I would find small tombs. These were almost always similar in style to the first dungeon, only without the moaning and no bosses. What I did find was information. Runes scribbled onto the walls that could be read. The description would almost always be vague, with phrases like a knowledgeful guide. Way to heavens. Sometimes they would be followed by other comments, but most writing seemed glitched and unintelligible. It seemed to be a history, though. The maps I sometimes found confirmed it. I simply explored, and after a while I learned to let instinct guide my way. Soon I found the next dungeon, a large pyramid rising out of the desert. Upside down. Over it, straight up to the sky, was another large upside-down temple. It stretched so far I couldn't see the top. But I couldn't keep going. I needed sleep again. The next day came, and I entered the dungeon. It was like all the small tombs I would find, only a bit more perilous. More bottomless pits. Chasms, spike traps, and monsters this time. Long arms that would grab you from out of the wall like wallmasters, only these simply threw you into the traps, killing you. What probably used to be redheads and skeletons. At the end of this dungeon, I found a large spiral staircase. I followed it up and up until I reached what seemed to be the top. It took 2 hours of climbing, but the time seemed to fly by. The top was merely a platform with a large, ornate arrow pointing off an edge. Since there was nowhere else to go, I jumped. The screen again flashed white, and I was in a new area. This went on for the next few weeks. There were many places to visit, and at times I could find the borders where one locale met another. I started to name the locations I had been to, but although I started knowing all the places intimately, there never seemed to be an end to new locations. Sometimes I would go through one door and come out on the other side of the world. Places didn't behave by constant rules of space, but it became easier to find my way regardless. Each time I revisited a place, it was rearranged in a different, more navigable setup. From every corner though, I could see the tower in the distance. I quickly realized that I had not reached the top, only fallen into one of many traps. In fact, I still have not reached the top. In the few times I went about the real world, I could feel that the game was different. It changed itself. It seemed to react to me. I was sure that a game like this should not have been able to be created. But then, they were going for a free roaming experience more similar to the original Zelda. What if they succeeded? They created a world one could always roam. And they really did create a world. I had learned of many gods in that land. The 3 goddesses who had created such a perverted, physical world. The god he who sees, who decided to cleanse it. I still don't know my own route, but I felt that if I simply followed my instincts, I could find my goal. That's why I'm writing this now. My instincts still tell me where to go. But it's not here. It's not in the game. I have to leave, and I will do it. But before I go, I feel I have to leave this message for someone to find. I should warn you though, it may be a game, but it knows you are playing.